Hi, sorry about that. We're having some technical difficulties on our end, but we were just reciting the promise of community action, and again, we wanted to welcome you all to our Decreasing Family Homelessness Question 3 webinar. So we're going to recite the promise. Again, community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, and improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. So as a part of the learning community, an integral part of the work that we do is facilitating the national webinar series. And this is really to provide you guys with more of a hands-on approach and an in-depth look at specific topic areas, and also by utilizing our research experts excuse me, to highlight promising anti-poverty approaches and strategies that are currently being utilized within the network. And with that, we are very pleased to welcome our presenters today. We're working with our national partners, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and right now I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia. But it looks like Cynthia might be having some trouble with her audio, so let's turn it over to Samantha, maybe until Cynthia jumps back on. So if you'd like to unmute yourself or mute her, maybe give an introduction, Samantha.
So this is Kay. I think maybe you unmuted me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, this is Samantha. Sorry about that. We are obviously having some technical difficulties, so I apologize, but I'm going to attempt to cover Cynthia's material since she doesn't appear to be able to get on right now. So first, I just want to introduce the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We're a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to the to ending homelessness through improving policy, building capacity, and educating opinion leaders. And on today's role, we're going to be discussing homelessness prevention. Some of the big questions that we're going to be attempting to answer are: what roles can CAP agencies play in prevention? What does research tell us about prevention? And what is the difference between prevention and diversion, which diversion is a term you'll hear later in the webinar. And then also, how can prevention resources be used to do diversion or to divert people from experiencing homelessness? And so I'm going to wait on this slide just until we get a little bit farther into Kay's presentation for how the CAP agencies can particularly play a role in diverting people. And I'm sure as soon as Cynthia is able to get on, she'll also have a lot to say about this as well. As I mentioned, my name is Samantha Batko. I'm the director of the research arm of the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and today I was asked to join the webinar in order to discuss what research suggests about using homeless assistance resources and other resources in a community for homelessness prevention. And so today what I'm going to do is discuss what research has told us about the inherent value in preventing homelessness, and then also I'm going to review the difficulties in understanding the effectiveness of homelessness prevention efforts and why that complicates understanding the impact that prevention can have. I'm also going to share some findings from some recent studies on prevention in order to shed some light on what communities in general and also CAP agencies can be doing to make prevention effective. And then finally, I'm going to share what the implications of all of the research that I presented on today are for communities. So first, addressing the very first question that I asked, which is what is the inherent value of preventing homelessness? And I think that it goes without question that there are some costs for families and individuals who become homeless that are not necessarily quantifiable and others that are. And so you all see this daily, so you know that homelessness disrupts the general everyday life of families and individuals. It disrupts employment. It disrupts school. It can cause the separation of children or a significant other from the family. It also, even more generally, disrupts the routines that families and individuals have in their life on a daily basis. Breakfast, getting out of the door to the bus stop, homework, family time. And so these are all costs to the individual that are very big and that really disrupt people's lives in a very significant way that can have long-lasting and, wide-ranging impacts on the rest of their life. And so there are other costs associated with homelessness as well that are more quantifiable. And so there are very concrete community costs that come from homelessness. This is the homeless programs themselves and the services that they provide. And there are a couple of studies that have looked at this, and one of the studies found that for first-time homelessness, the cost of first-time homelessness ranged from about $1,634 to $20,031, and this is per household. So this includes both families and individuals. There's a difference, though, between the cost of first-time homelessness among families and the cost of first-time homelessness among individuals. And the individuals tend to cost less than families do. Families have a tendency to cost more, both because their individual daily costs are higher, and then also their costs, they have a tendency to stay in the system a little bit longer than individuals do, so their costs over time are also higher. So among families, this study found that families cost about $3,000 to $20,000 for the first-time episode of homelessness, and that individuals cost about $1,600 to about $2,300 for a first-time episode. And again, this is also a very big generalization. This varies across geographies. It also varies across the characteristics of the individual families. So when you look at families that stay homeless for a short period of time, their costs are much less. They're only about $700 to about $9,000. But when you look at families who stay in the system for a long period of time, their costs range from about $6,500 to $38,000. And so there is a dollar amount assigned to how much it costs for a family to be homeless, and that's in shelter costs and services that they receive. And there's a dollar amount that prevention costs. And so one of the things that we'll spend a lot of time on today is talking about the differences in the dollars amounts and how they can be offset. I do want to touch on some of the studies that have looked at some of the broader societal costs of homelessness that do things like look at possible lost wages for children, the impacts of children not graduating from high school if they're homeless, and things such as that. I think that the costs that are included in these studies are very variable, so it's difficult to compare the studies to each other. But some of the studies have estimated that per person in Connecticut, family homelessness costs $33,360, and for an overall family, it costs about $125,000. In Pennsylvania, they found that per child, homelessness costs about $40,000. So these are not small impacts that we're talking about. Which, brings us to the thought that, like, in an ideal world, we would want to prevent all homelessness, right? That would be exactly what we wanted to do. Unfortunately, we live in a world that has resource constraints, and then it begs the question also, how do we know if we're actually preventing homelessness? And the obvious answer that one would want to give was, well, you give somebody homelessness prevention resources, and if they don't become homeless, you prevented it. But that's not actually the case. And so this is when we come to the complications of measuring the effectiveness of prevention. So, for example, if I gave everybody on this webinar homelessness prevention and none of you became homeless, I would think that I was running the best homelessness prevention program ever, because obviously none of you became homeless. But unfortunately, none of you would have become homeless probably in the first place, so I didn't actually prevent your homelessness. So this is a truth that I think that is very important for us to understand, is that most people, even those seeking assistance, do not become homeless. So this is reassuring for two reasons. The first is that it means that just because you don't have prevention resources to give someone, or that you're not offering someone resources, it doesn't mean that you're fating them to become homeless, that you're basically causing their homelessness. The tricky part is that this does make measuring the impact of homelessness very difficult. So on this slide, what you'll see is a very simplistic version of what researchers create with random assignment. And random assignment is great because it actually allows us to see the impact of prevention. So what you see here is really two very similar communities, or in the science world, one community where people have been randomly assigned into either A or B group. And so in community A, I'm just going to circle it here so that you guys can see what I'm talking about, this group over here, okay? In community A, there's no assistance. So 100 people approach your system and they ask for emergency assistance, but 0 people are given it. And out of that group, about 5 people become homeless. Now, you might be saying to me, oh, that's way too low a number, but this is actually very reflective of what prevention studies have found, that a very small percentage of people who approach asking for prevention assistance actually become homeless. And so, but then if you were to look at community B, let's see, so this community now over here, you had 100 people come in and ask for emergency assistance, and you were able, in your ideal world, to give them all prevention assistance. It was about $500 a person, so it cost the community about $50,000. And after that, only 2 people became homeless. So what you're thinking is, well, instead of 5 people becoming homeless, only 2 people became homeless. We cut homelessness in half. But you had to pay the other 95 people who would have never become homeless in the first place prevention resources. So what you really did is community B managed to prevent 3 people from becoming homeless at a total cost of $50,000, or about $17,000 per person. So this is really important because what you see here is community B, without doing the extra analysis, would think that 100 people asked for emergency assistance, 100 people were given prevention, and look, only 2 became homeless. So you would think that you had prevented 98 episodes of homelessness. But really, since 95 of those people would never have become homeless even if they weren't given assistance, you've really only prevented 3 episodes of homelessness. And so this should show you sort of the difficulty in assessing the impact of prevention, and also it lays out the really tricky line that a community has to walk in order to make prevention cost-effective. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about, hold on one sec. There we go, next slide. Okay, the question turns to how can a community make sure that what resources it is spending on prevention are being impactful? So a couple of recent studies have started to answer this question, and I'm going to just touch on 2 of them, which I think are probably the 2 most exemplary and also probably the 2 of the most rigorous ones. So one of them was a program in New York City called Homebase, and Homebase is a neighborhood-based prevention program where they put prevention resources and prevention case managers in communities that were specifically targeted because of a high-need population of people who worked neighborhoods that had very high entries into shelter. So this is a prevention program that is already targeted in some basis besides just people calling and asking for assistance. So even with this geographic targeting, only about 14.5% of the people who they ended up serving or who they didn't serve but who were eligible became homeless. So like when we go back to that one where I said, you know, in the community that didn't have any prevention, 5 people, this would be in a community that didn't have any home base, one of these neighborhoods, the people that they would have served, only 14 of them would have become homeless anyway. So with Homebase's assistance, that dropped down to 8%. So what we found was that because Homebase was able to decrease shelter entries by that 6.5 percentage points, there was actually cost effectiveness in New York City's Homebase program. But this is a very targeted program. It's targeted geographically, and then it's also, people are screened into it for other risk factors. And so the average cost savings for the treatment group, the people who actually got assistance, was about $2,375. And they received about $140 in average assistance. So, and an important note is that the assistance that Homebase provided wasn't entirely financial. There were people who didn't get any financial assistance and just got case management, and there were people who did get financial assistance. So prevention doesn't always have to be a financial like rent assistance or utility assistance. It can also be a case manager who helps to do, conflict mediation with somebody who's living with a family member and things like that. And the great thing about Homebase was it produced a really great data set that people could do additional analyses on. And so there was some additional studies done on the same group, and what they found was that when they separate out the families into low-risk groups versus high-risk groups, so these are already a very vulnerable group of people, but even once you took that and stratified it again, the low-risk families weren't really helped by the program at all. The rates of shelter entry for those who received services were about the same as the rates of shelter entry for those who didn't receive services, and they were extremely low. In contrast, when you looked at the high-risk group, the services seem to have the biggest impact on those who were considered the highest risk. And so this is important for two reasons. The first being that prevention resources probably are the most impactful when they're targeted to the highest risk groups, and they're probably also the most cost-effective when they're targeted to the highest risk groups. But secondly, what they found was that there were no families who were so vulnerable that prevention could not help them. So there's no risk with prevention of targeting too deep that you're spending prevention resources on families that quote unquote aren't going to make it even with prevention resources, that that they need to go into shelter and then into a bigger program. And then I think that it's important to note that based on what the analyses that they did, they found some things that were particularly strong predictors of shelter entry, and the biggest of those being previous experience in shelter as an adult. So a head of household who had been in shelter in a previous year or so as an adult, not as a child. And then some other factors that they found and flagged were involvement with Child Protective Services, that they had applied for shelter entry within the previous 3 months, so that they've applied for shelter entry and they're approaching again and asking for shelter entry again, that they were a parent under the age of 22, and that they had moved more than 4 times in the last year. The second study that I want to talk about is a pretty similar study in Chicago. It's an examination of prevention that was given out during the period of HPRP, and it shows some pretty similar results. The difference is that in this instance, the prevention in Chicago was not targeted well, or it wasn't targeted really at all. It was when prevention assistance was available, people called in and were able to get it, and when it was not available, people didn't get it. And so unlike New York, this was not a particularly targeted program. And when you think back to the slides that I had for communities A and B, the results of this prevention program are very similar to that slide. So if 100 people had called into the Chicago program, only about 2 of them, and did not receive assistance, only about 2 of them would eventually have become homeless. For the people that called into the Chicago program and got prevention assistance, less than 1 person would have become homeless. So while it did basically cut homelessness almost in half, you can see that they had to provide prevention assistance for 98 to 99 people who would have never become homeless in the first place. When you look at the results for their overall sample, you'll see that the reduction in homelessness without targeting is not enough to actually create cost savings. So the cost per homeless spell averted in Chicago without any targeting was only $10,300. So basically, they were paying $10,300 to avert 1 episode of homelessness. There was some additional analysis done on the data set, though, which I think is really important and aligns very nicely with what they found in New York City. So they took some different cuts at the group that had received and the group that hadn't received assistance, and they found that the impact for lower income populations was not as great as for higher income populations. So the lower income group benefited 6 times as much from homelessness prevention resources than the higher income group did. So this improves both the impact of the prevention, meaning that you are preventing more instances of homelessness, and also increases the likelihood that it is cost effective. So what does all of this mean for communities? And that's the big question. That's the reason that we're here today. And there are, I think, really four main things here. The first are resource decisions. And this is really about resources that are not dedicated to prevention through other means. So you may have in your community some private funders who are invested in homelessness prevention, and that's what they do. Or oftentimes you might have a church or a community group that is really invested in homelessness prevention, and that's just the activity that they do. This is about resources that are more flexible, that you can make decisions about whether or not to spend something on prevention or whether or not to spend it in the shelter, getting people rapidly rehoused and getting people out of the homelessness into housing. And so that's a question that every community should have, like a discussion that every community should have. Because of the difficulties in targeting prevention, how much of your resources that does it make sense to put into prevention when you know that you're ending homelessness if you're serving a homeless family? So that's the first one. The second two are really that, like I said, some communities might have some resources that are dedicated to prevention that they don't have the flexibility to put anywhere else. And so the question becomes, what do you do with those resources that you can't move into a different thing, that are dedicated to prevention, or that you have decided that you want to spend on prevention? And so there's two things that you have to look at here. The first is, where do you put your prevention intervention points? In a lot of communities right now, people call 211 looking for homeless utility assistance, things like that, and they get access to homelessness prevention. One thought would be to put it much farther downstream, perhaps at the shelter door, so that you're screening out people who are able to get assistance some other way or who end up not actually needing assistance. The second thing is to do deeper targeting of your prevention. And so, like we were talking about with New York City and with Chicago, targeting the lowest income people that you can, people who had experienced homelessness prior to this episode of asking for assistance, people who have some other like CPS involvement, lots and lots of moves over the course of last year. They're showing a lot of residential instability beyond just, I need help making rent this month. And it's important to remember that what we learned in New York City was that there isn't a household that's too vulnerable to benefit from prevention. So there's no reason to have a cutoff in saying that these people are too far along, we shouldn't do prevention with them. And then the last thing is, if you are going to be investing money in prevention, it makes sense to do some ongoing monitoring and evaluation. And I'd recommend partnering with a local university. You know, there's always PhD students who are looking to write a dissertation or any of their other writing materials that they have to produce. And so they can replicate some of the other types of studies that have been done. And so you don't also have to do random assignment. Most places don't have prevention resources available year-round. So you can actually use gaps in available prevention resource as a way to do random assignments. So when prevention resources are available, that's the group of people who randomly get prevention. And then when the resources run out, you have a group of people who probably are statistically similar to the group who applied originally but got them, and so that's your control group right there. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I'm going to be available for questions at the end of Kay's presentation, but I'm going to turn it over to Kay to talk about how all of this rolls out on the ground and what this all looks like in practice in a community.
So, Sam, this is Cynthia, actually. So I'm just going to, sorry I was not on earlier, and I'm just going to quickly take folks back to the slide that I was going to present because I wanted to make sure that we tied all of this to community action agency work, and then I'll hand it right over to Kay. So, Sam, thank you very much for presenting that research. And as folks who are on the call can probably understand that the reason we're presenting this research and the reason that we're going to have Kay talk about best practices is because we know that community action agencies play a very important role in preventing and ending homelessness in many communities across the country. And community action agencies, particularly in more rural parts of the country, are sometimes the key service provider in a big region, which means that you are working with a broad group of people who are struggling to maintain housing stability as well as actually experiencing homelessness. So the different types of households that Samantha was talking about in her research are, we know many of the different kinds of households you are seeing. And so we want to recognize that you're serving many different kinds of households. And as Sam very as Sam pointed out, what does this mean for community action agencies? The question we're really trying to answer is, who should get these prevention resources that we have? How do we target them to actually prevent homelessness? And that's what we're going to have Kay also talk a little about actually in practice. And I want to recognize that some community action agencies have become quite familiar with providing prevention assistance to people who are on the verge or imminently at risk of homelessness, because some community action agencies on today's call are actually receiving supportive services for veteran families funds, which is a VA-funded program that provides rapid rehousing and prevention assistance to veterans and their families to prevent and end homelessness amongst veterans in communities. And there are also folks who have emergency shelters who are also figuring out how to use their prevention resources. And particularly with the SSVF providers, they have tools and parameters they're following to help them target their scarce resources as effectively as possible to have the biggest impact on homelessness. And they're using those tools are really relying on the kinds of research and a lot of the data that Sam has just presented. You might be wondering, why sometimes you're getting phone calls from people that you really think should get your prevention assistance, but they don't kind of fit through your screener. And it's really based on the reasons that Sam was presenting, that we know a little bit more about folks who are, imminently at risk of homelessness and trying to target the resources towards them to have the biggest impact. And so other providers on the call today may actually be providing more traditional prevention assistance, such as eviction prevention, and really serving households that are a little bit more, as we say, upstream, meaning they're a little bit further away or a lot further away from actually becoming homeless, or may never actually be at risk for becoming homeless, but they are actually struggling in other ways and are calling for assistance. So Kay is now really going to talk about how in practice, using the research that Sam talked about, how in practice, what the best practices are to really have a more significant impact on preventing and reducing actual homelessness by diverting people away from homelessness and using your resources as in a targeted way as possible. So Kay Mosier-McDivitt, I want to just mention, is our Senior Technical Assistance Specialist at the Center for Capacity Building at the Alliance, and she does work across the country helping communities build their diversion process and really understand how to use their prevention resources.
Thanks, Cynthia. So I'm going to move the slides forward, and we apologize for all this back and forth. So, what I want to talk a little bit about then is, how you really put prevention into practice. And in essence, if we start thinking about what we want to do is really, if we're looking at homelessness prevention, we really want to divert folks from the front door. And I think the front door shelter and really divert folks from actually having to come into the shelter system, particularly families, because we understand and know the trauma, particularly for children, that happens when they actually end up having to live in the shelter system. So Sam set the stage for what the research shows, and I think one of the things that happens, and I think Sam so eloquently talked about this, is we just keep learning more and more. And I, like many of you, when I was actually in the field in practice, we had a homeless prevention program, and we consistently talked about, we looked at our data and, we served all these people, and only 2 or 3 households became homeless within, 6 months. We always looked at 6 months from the time we prevented the assistance. And, and we thought we had this really successful program. And then as we got some more assistance through the HPRP days, and now in the work of working at the Alliance, we're just learning so much more. When we look at communities are really seeing their homeless numbers starting to come down, particularly seeing drops in family homelessness, a lot of what we're finding is they're really starting to use their prevention resources very differently and very strategically. So I'm going to really think about this diversion thing that we hear about. One of the things that we often hear is that communities that will talk about prevention and diversion as 2 different programs. We have a prevention program and a diversion program. But in essence, what we want to talk about today is that diverting folks from an actual needing to get into an actual shelter bed is going to be the most effective way to really ensure that your local prevention resources directly are reducing episodes of homelessness in your community. And So there's a couple of things, that happens is that when we bring it to that front door shelter, and what we mean by that is whether, you have a coordinated entry system where when somebody thinks they're going to be homeless and they're calling in for a shelter bed, or somebody actually shows up at a shelter, even if there's beds available, it doesn't mean that we assess somebody to say, can they come into the shelter? Instead, we start thinking about, can we prevent this person from coming in that shelter door? So on this next slide, what is it really when we think about shelter diversion? And I mentioned a little bit as we think about it and look at it, and particularly around families, one of the first places to start is really looking at where do most families come from when they enter the shelter bed and they come into a shelter bed, where did they stay the night before? And one of the things we have found more probably around families than around singles, but when I've looked at family data and I've helped some communities look at their data, is that sometimes as much as 2/3, and I've seen it as high in one community of almost 3/4 of families were coming from doubled-up situations, and yet that very community was screening out anybody for homeless prevention assistance that was doubled up. And so there was a mismatch between who can we really prevent, a literal homeless episode where somebody's coming into a shelter bed, and, from versus somebody that may be evicted. So part of it is looking at your data and seeing what that matches. So when we think about what homeless diversion is, it's a strategy that prevents homelessness, and I'm going to just read it from the slide, by helping people that are experiencing a housing crisis and they're seeking emergency shelter. So the "and" is very important there, because a lot of people have housing crisis, but if you're seeking emergency shelter and you're trying to preserve your current housing situation or make immediate alternative arrangements without having to enter shelter. And I think it's really important because sometimes, even in a doubled up situation, and by the way, that term just sort of has those negative connotations, but, a lot of times there might just be some family conflict or something, or friend conflict that sometimes there can be resolution so that folks don't have to move into the system. Children don't have to leave where they are, but we can still work with them without making them have to come into a shelter bed to get those services. And I also think one of the things we've heard from communities is that you really need to think of diversion not as a program and not as something separate you do, but it's really part of the entire crisis response system, sort of wherever those points of entry into the shelter system are, that across that system, this is about using problem-solving skills, the kinds of things that, most of us in the helping profession, social work profession, have always done, helping folks to really look at solving the problem and come up with solutions, which doesn't necessarily mean, paying for some rent or financial assistance. A lot of times it can be other things than that. But the one important thing is we're really looking at this and thinking about, can we divert somebody from shelter, is the option that we're looking at safe and appropriate for clients? And I think that's particularly in situations with domestic violence. There may be alternatives that, but maybe that other option might be in a neighborhood where an abuser still lives, or where there, would be some threat to that particular person. And so, that has to be taken into consideration. But we're finding in many cases, particularly around families, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, that communities are finding that they're able to significantly divert a number of households. So what would be reasons to bring this? So Sam already talked about that cost effectiveness. So to sort of bullet this out, it's really important to think about the fact that in our communities, many people experience a housing crisis. Many folks, and we've done this in communities, that you look at how many people live in extreme poverty in your community, and then you compare that number against the number that actually become homeless. And in most communities, it's only about 3 to 5%. If that. Sometimes it's even lower than that. And then we look at those households that are severely rent burdened, meaning they're paying 50% or more towards their housing, and those are the families that we often see calling for eviction prevention resources. And yet, again, when we compare those numbers, that's when it gets up more into only about 6 to 7% of that total number of people ever become homeless. So what we have to realize is that a lot of folks have a housing crisis, but that doesn't mean that they can't resolve it without getting some financial assistance. assistance. And I think Sam already talked about this, is that traditional prevention typically does start further upstream. And the other thing we learned is a lot of times the very people that really need the assistance are being screened out, because a lot of communities use the sustainability factor. Do we think they have enough income, or they require folks to have a certain amount of income or to pay no more than 30% of their income towards housing costs, or have all these ways of screening out those folks that are really the highest need folks, and those that are closest to homelessness. And when we flip that around and we learn through HPRP days, homeless prevention and rapid housing, that many of your communities may have gotten to use prevention dollars, we found communities that actually use that level of 15% of serving only people with prevention assistance that were at 15% or lower of median income, not the 50, not the 50%, the 50%. Because in fact, the folks that were at 50% of median income, don't usually show up at the shelter door when you look at your data. So we've really found that traditional eviction prevention has not been as critical to reducing homelessness. So here's what we have learned when you really start shifting those resources right there at that front door. And we have that sort of in parentheses, the front door shelter. It doesn't mean that the funding has to go with the coordinated entry, but it's like if somebody's calling, how do we engage those folks that have the prevention resources to provide the assistance for those folks that are calling for shelter? First of all, it's going to improve your system outcomes, because we're really finding it reduces entries into homelessness. And it also improves quality of life by helping people stay out of shelter and avoid distress, which we talked about, the trauma that coming into shelter. Sam already indicated that we find that families often end up, when they get in the shelter system, they end up staying in the shelter system longer, and we know that the longer the children are in the shelter system, the more trauma that they experience. So it's really important to think of it that way. And then it conserves and targets the resources that we have, particularly shelter beds, are used only when needed. So it comes down to that fourth bullet. What we're learning from communities, particularly on the family side, that are really starting to think about diversion as how they're doing homeless prevention, is it's hugely cutting down on waiting lists and having a huge impact on even communities often having empty beds, which is then they're there so that when there is that family in crisis, is actually if they can't come into that bed, they're going to be sleeping in their car that night, or they're going to be, sleeping outside somewhere, because there is absolutely no place else for them to go. We don't have to put them on a waiting list and have them sleep in their car because we filled up the beds with people that may have not needed that resource. So I have to tell you, I keep forgetting to flip the slides. So when you look at this, we sort of put on here, what are the housing situations and how do we think of it? So traditional prevention has been an imminent risk of losing housing and being evicted. And when we think of diversion, I've highlighted this, that this is really when you're looking at requesting shelter. And then rapid rehousing is when somebody is already literally in a shelter or in a place not meant for human habitation. They're literally meeting that definition of homelessness, and we use rapid rehousing. So when you look at all of these resources on the right side here, when you look at everything, all of these resources here, and my circle is not as good as Sam's, but these are all eligible things, services that we can provide, whether we're doing traditional prevention, whether we're doing diversion, or whether we're doing rapid rehousing. But I think that what often happens with prevention, and even with rapid rehousing, we often look at sort of, does this household need a rental subsidy? Do they need financial assistance? And sometimes, we'll do the housing search, and we find that maybe it doesn't happen as much in prevention, although it is an eligible activity. Even if somebody can't stay where they are, you could actually help them find an alternative living situation. And rapid rehousing often starts there. But the difference, now I have to get rid of that, okay. But I think the difference with diversion is you start here. You first start with the problem solving. So these last four bullets that I'm going to circle down, you're actually starting with problem solving. Instead of talking about the financial assistance and the rental subsidy, it actually starts at the problem solving discussion about, can you retain the current housing situation you're in, even if you're living with family and friends? What might it take to make that a better situation? Then it also includes, stabilization support, follow-up support. So I think that it's really important to know that it's not just about a one-time intervention. It's not about a one-time conversation, but it's also like if we're going to help a household stay there, is there something we can do to follow up with them to make it work better? Mediation is really important, and this is whether it's mediation maybe with, if somebody is still housed, and it might take some mediation with a landlord, sort of the same things that you do when you're doing a housing search and trying to work with landlords. With a landlord, we found when I was actively at the community level initially when HPRP started, we actually found out that we were able to mediate with landlords, and sometimes if this had been a good tenant for a long time and they were literally going to enter the shelter system, and they had this blip in the road, and the landlord said, look, I'm willing to lower the rent, I'm willing to work with them because they've been a tenant of mine for a while. We had never asked landlords to do that before, and so that we often didn't have to pay for some of the things we thought we needed to do, like past rent due or additional security deposits. So it's really interesting to think about mediation, but not only then with landlords, but also if folks are living with somebody and there's been some breakdown in the dynamics of the living together situation, with family or friends. Maybe there's a, mom and her child that's staying with the grandma, and they've been there for a while, but now it's been there's been a problem recently. Sometimes just mediating that and working with those two populations, the two people that are presenting coming into the shelter can really make a big difference. And then I think it's really important to also realize this connection to the mainstream resources and the supports. These kinds of things are going to be really important to look at. What are those natural supports that these households have? How can we help them get what they need and start, really connecting them with the services they might have? And it's not just about the types of things that we often think of like other types of forms of assistance, but rather, who do they already know in the community? Are they connected with their faith community? Do they maybe have a connection at the school? Do they have some neighbors? Do they have, people that live even in other communities that might be willing to help them, helping them really identify those supports? So when we talk about the keys to successful diversion, there's some real key bullet points, and I've already talked about this first one. Your community really should have some sort of coordinated entry process, and getting diversion, getting your prevention resources. Think about, when somebody's calling and looking for a shelter bed, how do we now connect those folks with the prevention resources that are available so that we're really utilizing them in the best way possible, since the research shows that that's going to be much more effective. And I know there's some communities that use a 211 system, and the 211 workers actually end up having those initial conversations and really working through some of that initial stuff. But even past that then, it's not just that even if they sort of get to that point, and even in that initial conversation, I just was talking to somebody in Memphis, Tennessee that's doing diversion, and she said what they find out is even when they've worked with a family at the shelter door and they've actually, looked at all the resources, and that family says, nope, there is not, and the conclusions come that we really need to get this family into a family bed, and they find them the bed, and they set it, that the family can go directly to that shelter, and they find that there's still a percent, and she indicated depending on what time of year, sometimes it's as much as 40% of the families that get assigned to a shelter bed, even after they've had the diversion conversation, they still don't show up the shelter bed. And what she said is what she's realized is that sometimes that thinking process starts during the conversation with staff, and then folks leave and go, wait, there are some other solutions to this. So, I think we have to realize that there's multiple places, even if you start a coordinated entry. Even when somebody shows up at the shelter door, conversations can still happen about alternative solutions. You want to have staff that are very resourceful. You also really want to look at the training. This is really different than traditional case management. It really is about mediation skills and learning how to do mediation. In Cleveland, they actually worked with a mediation center and used them to provide the diversion services, the prevention services at the front door, because they were already trained in mediation and just found that was very effective. And everything needs to really be focused not on a needs assessment, but rather a strengths assessment. What are the resources and the strengths that this household may have that they can use, and really helping them to problem solve. Remember I talked about earlier that there's a lot of folks that experience severe housing crisis or severely housing burden, but they end up not coming into our shelter system. We never see them, which means that folks that experience deep poverty and really experience housing crisis in your community can be really resourceful. They have incredible strength to resolve their own situations without coming to the front door. So I think we have to recognize that and really encourage the folks that are coming that there are solutions, and that, you know, we know that they've got a lot of strengths and a lot of their own natural supports to really look at and encourage them to do that. I think this fourth bullet here with the check mark is important. Again, the client choice and safety, to always remember that, you know, you do want to make sure that you're not, if somebody's in a situation where their safety is endangered, you wouldn't want that, you know, to continue to stay there. Even if they were able to, you want to make sure that you wouldn't keep somebody in an abusive situation. And then I talked about this on the other side, the linkages to mainstream services and natural support, so I'm not going to talk about that more. But I think it's this other thing about flexibility. When you do have to use financial resources, you know, can they be flexible? We're hearing from communities that sometimes all somebody needs maybe is a bus pass to get back to where they came from, even if they've been in your community a couple of years. They just don't have any ability to get back where they came from. We've even heard, we heard this, I was doing a training in Florida the other week, and as we talked about this diversion at that training, somebody came up afterwards and said, you know, what we learned as we talked is that really this guy just needed a pair of work boots, because he hadn't been able to go to work because they required him to have these safety boots, and he didn't have the money to come in it, and nobody would give him the safety boots, and he got behind in his rent, and, you know, a number of those things. And, you know, so sometimes it's some other resources and solutions besides the traditional rental assistance that we think about. So, you know, even if the funding source that you have says you can only use it for A, B, C, and D, we have to be really creative about are there other donor, you know, private sources that we could get to have some flexible dollars. But I also want to say in that the other thing that we've heard is that, in fact, the majority of communities are doing this are finding that they give less financial assistance and do much more of this with just staff time, with resources on staff time spent with having conversations than actually giving financial resources. So I cannot for some reason get my next slide to go. There we go. So when you think about this, you know, even if you use an assessment tool, a lot of times what coordinated assessment does, or the front door shelter does, is sort of does a tool to say, well, what programs are you eligible to enter, or who has a bed? And we do this sort of checklist tool of do an assessment and eligibility, and yes, you're eligible for this, you've gone through this, and, you know, and then we do either the full intake or we put in a wait list. This gives you a concept of this is sort of how we shift this to think about how do we do prevention at that coordinated entry, that approach at that front door. So it more is about what would resolve your current housing crisis, and not just about the financial assistance, but are there other kinds of things that we could do to resolve your current housing crisis? And then it becomes not just this checklist, but more of a structured problem-solving conversation about the household situation and other resources that might be available to them. So while there may be some initial questions that are on checklist, I know with SSVF, for any of you that are doing SSVF, that there's been this tool that's really created to really look at, you know, folks that can be diverted if you ask these questions, and these are where you need to be diverting. But I think it's not so much asking questions as much as just engaging in the conversation around the questions that are on your tool, and not just going through this, you know, question 1, question 2, question 3, and then answering yes or no, but rather creating a conversation. I know that in some communities they sort of put, you know, a sample script and have folks sort of practice it with their colleagues, and getting colleagues to sort of role play it to sort of get used to having a conversation. And then I think the last thing is not about an intake or getting people on a waiting list for that next bed, but it's rather using prevention resources to support crisis resolution to avoid the shelter entry. So I know I'm talking fast, and I'm going to try to, you know, slow down, but we also want to give you plenty of time for questions. So as I've gone through this, you've heard me say a couple of times that conversation, but there's actually 4 C's of diversion. I sort of came up with calling it the 4 C's of diversion. And by the way, it used to be the 3 C's of diversion. And now we're talking about the 4 C's of diversion. And the reason we're talking about the 4 C's of diversion is because as we've learned more, we are hearing themes from communities that are successfully really using prevention resources to look at shelter diversion and finding that having a significant impact on reducing family homelessness in their communities. There are certain themes that have every community you're hearing. The first is that there has to be this real commitment and like a culture so that the full community really believes that this is the best way to use the resources and really a culture that it's always best to look at alternative situations rather than giving a shelter bed. And folks should not have to come into a shelter bed to get the kinds of services. And we're even hearing that there's some communities where with the rapid rehousing resources, folks were coming in and feeling like they had to get a shelter bed so they could get the rapid rehousing resources. But all of those resources should be available without somebody needing a shelter bed under the prevention model. The second one you've heard me talk about is conversation. The third one is creativity. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It takes a lot of really creative people to think through these solutions. And the last one then is the continuous, that it's not just a one-time intervention, but it may require a little bit more. So I'm going to dig a little deeper into each of these. So a diversion culture really means that mainstream. So when we talk, mainstream providers, so even if your local TANF office might have some prevention resources and sort of any of the sort of standard providers in the community where you go towards for prevention. And then also homeless service providers really need to embrace the idea that households are better served outside of the homeless system, and that's true homelessness prevention. And then the second one is that funders, folks that fund prevention resources and providers that provide it are really committed to the use of the prevention resources, both personnel, both staffing, and the financial, really at that, and I should have put this in parentheses, that shelter front door, that it really needs to be when somebody's calling for shelter is the best way you're going to target the resources and have the largest impact on reducing homelessness in the community. The next one is the diversion conversation, and I don't think I can say enough about this. Every time we've asked folks to present at any of our conferences that are really having incredible success at reducing homelessness through prevention using diversion from shelter is that they talk about it's not about the money, it's about the conversation. So diversion really is a problem-solving, strength-based conversation. It's not just about a tool with a list of questions. And while the tool is useful in helping you create that conversation, it's really that, case management interviewing 101 that many of us took, back when we were in school, like, that how do you interview, how do you get people, how do you engage people to really talk about their situation. And it really needs to be, and I took this directly from somebody that's doing the study, this needs to be a realistic discussion about, their housing, employment, financial needs, but not the needs, and she really stressed it's about their opportunities. So a lot of times we look at the needs and we look at needs assessments and say, do they need prevention assistance versus what are the other opportunities they may have? And then I've also heard this, that it's really also thinking about, if you're in a double situation that's just not going well, I've been living here and somebody's kicked me out, or, we've had an overcrowded situation and it worked for a while and now the landlord's saying we have to leave. We've even seen some folks, by really looking at how to use prevention to divert from shelter is really actually helping that household find housing that is going to work for them because the living together is really a good thing, that they're supporting each other, especially, if they're moms with children. It really helps to have a single mom. It really helps to have another adult in the household, but it's more about the, being crowded or maybe not being planned. So, how do we work that out? So maybe it's just contributing household supplies. Maybe it's just helping to come up with an agreement about, who's going to be responsible for making meals. That's where the mediation skills come in. And the last bullet is something that we've been hearing from more and more folks doing this, is that really helping families understand that shelter is not the pie in the sky. It's not the place that you're going to automatically get all of these resources or services. You're not going to get a voucher if you come into the system. You're not necessarily going to, automatically get rapidly housing, because most communities have, more folks needing rapidly rehoused than what they have the resources to do. But that really staying out of the shelter system and getting your services is much better. And so it's really helping. Sometimes folks have gotten this idea that maybe coming into the shelter is going to make them eligible for a Section 8 voucher or some other resource, but it's really helping folks think on other ways of resolving their situation, and that helps that conversation move along. And then there's the creativity. So it's really about looking at creative solutions and exploring any potential option. And it's more about the solutions and financial assistance. And we heard this repeatedly, not so much about the rental assistance, but the staff time. That in general, what they're finding is that folks that got rental assistance was much. When you looked at the total populations that were assisted in the program, a lot more of them just got more time and sort of problem-solving services, and not necessarily financial assistance. And so it's about what other options might be available, what are the current support systems, is there somebody, if there's nobody local, is there somebody in another community that could be a resource. And I talked about that flexible funding, so maybe it's a bus ticket home, maybe it's buying some resource or helping somebody, fix a car. Maybe, folks were living together and it was working well because, the household that came in to live with the other household had a car that they were both using, and now the car's not available, so the original household, after, a year or two, says, okay, well, if you don't have a car for me to use, then it's not going to work out, so maybe we could help get that car fixed. Just being incredibly creative in how we think about preventing that episode of homelessness for that household, because that's what prevention needs to do. And this last one is just continuous. The diversion conversation may need to happen more than once, and not thinking about it as a one-time service, and I missed that second parentheses there. So, really thinking about that follow-up needs to be incorporated into the services provided. And so, if your staff are working with this and having these conversations, offer that you will follow up in a day or two to see how things are going. Making sure that it's not, and making sure also that even if it's like we've resolved this, that if it happens again, please call back in. It doesn't mean that we can't still help you again. And I think, again, getting away from that model of like we give you only one-time assistance and then you can't get anything else. I think one of the things we've learned is that, an episode of homelessness is about the only indicator of future episodes of homelessness. So even if somebody's gotten some assistance before, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't provide assistance again, especially if we're right there at that front door and helping the folks that are literally at that door of homelessness. It's moving away from that other model where, if we give you assistance once in a year, you need to wait maybe 18 months to come back in again. If we're not looking at it as eviction, necessarily just eviction prevention and sustainability, but rather looking at really preventing that episode of homelessness, it's important to get it at that front door. So, just these quick community examples. So I talked about it. So Southeastern Connecticut, and this is just on the family side. So they started, the initial calls go into their call center, and they have these, it's not like 211, but there's, an initial call center that calls go into. And then, so some initial diversion happens there. And then they actually go to these points where they come in for sort of that, if they get through that, then somebody, is calling and they still think they need a shelter bed. And so, they're able to come in and make those immediate appointments in that day. And then that's where a lot more conversation happens. And what they did, and this is where it's significant, look at this in 2015, 79% of families that were calling in thinking they needed a shelter bed that night were diverted from shelter. That's a huge difference. And the average cost compared to what Sam talked about is what the cost of it was. When they looked at every household where they prevented homelessness, the average cost came down to only $1,649, which is significant. That's like about a tenth of what Sam was showing in some of the studies where it was not being targeted. And what they were able to do then is that they were actually able in their community to reduce their shelter beds from 83 shelter beds to 53, because and these were the family beds, when they discovered that just because somebody looked eligible for shelter didn't mean that they still couldn't be prevented from homelessness by getting resources at the front door. They discovered they could do a lot more. So they actually, the shelter in that particular community is actually doing and has the prevention resources there. So to look at another community, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. So Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and this is singles and families, not just families. But they found that 85, they thought, again, because they knew it was conversation, but those conversations, an hour's worth of conversation, they're finding 80% of those conversations can happen in an hour. They have housing resource centers around their community where folks can come in if they think they need a shelter. And by the way, this is not a homeless prevention point of entry. This is not a point of entry for people that, have an eviction notice. This is called a shelter point of entry. This is specifically for households that you come to these housing resource center if you need a shelter bed. So they've already, done that sort of initial screening. So these are the households that think they need a shelter bed. And what they discovered is in 2015, 64% of clients, but that includes families and individuals, diverted. So huge numbers. I mean, when you think about that, and these are both communities that are experiencing significant decreases in family homelessness. So, and their cost came in even less. And by the way, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania is a really high-cost community. It's one of the highest in the state of Pennsylvania, where a one-bedroom unit can go for about $1,400. So in light of that, they're still able to really see that the average cost on prevention assistance is where it is. And so they also talked about, and I think one of the things is that, about 15% were, in housing, but thought that they needed to leave that day, and by mediation with landlords, they were actually to help 15% of them staying there. 35% were in a doubled-up situation, that term we call doubled up, and they were able to stay there. 12% moved to other housing. And then there were, some other things as well. But I think, again, it just shows that, sort of our traditional way of looking at what works is very different in all of this. So in summary, it's really important to maximize your community resources. Really think about what's the best use of the prevention dollars. And when I talk about dollars, I'm not just talking about the amount being used for prevention assistance, for the financial assistance, but also what it's costing for the staffing. What's the best way we can really staff and finance, and use our prevention programs, and how can we get them as close as possible to that point where people believe they need a shelter bed that night. And it's really, again, next bullet, really not thinking about homeless prevention diversion as just like, well, you go to this program, but rather something that our whole system embraces, and that everybody should really be having these conversations. Because it's, if you've done things differently for a long time, we found that in our community when our community action program really shifted to this new model. In the early HPRP days, it really took a long time because they had been doing things in a specific way, and folks sort of got used to the way, if I call CAP, this is, and I know we call it CAP, not CAA, but, that this is the way we get the assistance in our community. So it also took, sort of educating, the community on the difference in how we look at it. So that's that shift in culture. And you will find that many people are going to stay where they are or end up back where they came from, and that's still better as shelter as long as it's safe. And this idea that having empty shelter beds is a bad thing, but really empty shelter beds and dissolving a waiting list is what, how do you know this is working? And that's going to be one of your first indicators, where we're not always full. Our family shelters are not always full. We don't have these long waiting lists of families that are on shelter. And, as long as you don't see a bunch of unsheltered families, if you're finding that you have a ton of families that are sleeping in cars or, living in a makeshift tent out in the woods, and we hope that should never happen in any communities. As long as, you're not seeing that, empty beds are a good thing, and it means that you really are preventing homelessness for a lot of your households. And then remember the 4 C's of diversion: the commitment, the culture of commitment, the conversation, the creativity, and the continuous event of diversion. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Cynthia to answer any questions that have come in.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, thank you very much for walking us through some really detailed recommended best practices. We have a few questions, and I am going to just ask. Some of them seem appropriate for both of you, so I'll just start asking the questions. So one of the questions that just came in is, and Kay, you just talked a lot about how this is really a process. Diversion is a conversation. There is a lot of stages that go into it. It's not just about a checklist, but people, I think, sometimes want to know what questions, if you do have a tool or you do have screening questions, what kind of tool, what kind of questions should you be using, and how does that fit into this larger process? If you do have a tool you would recommend. And I think I can go to Sam or to Kay. So why don't we start with Kay?
Okay, I had to get myself off mute. So yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think that, we sometimes having a questionnaire or tool just sort of makes it sort of, feel simple. Like, is there, in the early days we used to talk about, well, is there a school that we use, when to use it? But I think that, where you start is when somebody's calling in, you start, you get the basics. And because the other thing is, how do we know this is working? You do need to sort of be able to follow this. And so you need those basic, HMIS, the things that you would go into an HMIS system or a database, like, the basic demographics of the person, so that we would know if they would head to shelter later. But then you start with saying, I need to get the information, which is the first thing. But then that first question should be, tell me a little bit about your current situation and why you're calling for shelter. And so it's not so much a yes or no checklist, but that opens up the conversation. And sometimes, and again, you know this, it can be, some people will give you a 1 or 2 word answer, some people will give you their life story. And so it's you really using those interviewer skills and then targeting, like, so where were you last night? And what changed between last night and today, and that brought you in and had you call us? And is there, questions like, is there something I could do? Is there somebody I could call? Is there, and then, and if you can't resolve that, so the first thing is, can we resolve where you currently are? And then if we can't resolve that, it would be, well, could you stay there? Sometimes could you stay there a couple more nights? And that's where it's that safety thing. Could you stay there a couple more nights? And maybe we could explore some other options. And then and if they say, well, yeah, maybe I could stay there, 2 or 3 nights. And I think always offering that I'd be willing to call that place, or, if it's a landlord, I'd be willing to, I'm going to be locked out today and I have nowhere to go. I don't have any family or friends and I'm going to literally be locked out today. Well, I'd be willing to call the landlord, or, could we maybe find somebody else? Could I call somebody for you? And maybe if you're uncomfortable, I'd be happy to help you. What we're finding is that then offering to do those things can help people identify, some of the resources they have. And also, sometimes calling those other places that, might be resources for them, if the current situation they know that they're in, if that landlord or if that family that they're currently with, knows that they've got somebody that's going to be working with them and helping them resolve that situation, that can just resolve sort of that immediate crisis at that point. So I think it's just focused on your current housing situation, what has changed, and is there something that I could do to help you with that situation? Is there somebody I could call to sort of resolve this immediate crisis? Because sometimes if we can resolve that immediate crisis, some of that problem-solving stuff will happen. Sam, I don't know if you have any other, specific thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do think that there is an element to which, like, the people who become homeless, it's very situational, and that you know, even though I talked about risk factors, you know, there are people who could have been homeless prior who approach for prevention who might not have become homeless anyway. And so what Kay is saying about the actual practice of this, being a conversation with a person and helping them find alternatives in a really proactive way, and a way that you're listening to people describe their situation and being creative is really important. I think there are some advantages to a screening tool, though. And I think that the two main ones that I would name is that when you have a very high volume of calls, an initial screening tool can help you decide who among those who are calling in are worth having the more in-depth conversation with that Kay is describing. So like if you have just overwhelming numbers of calls, and most of them might be for things like utility assistance or things like that where you're really trying to decide how to target or pick who among those people you actually spend time working with, a screening tool may be helpful. The other thing that a screening tool does, I think, is it provides you know, it gives you some legitimacy. When you say we have a screening tool that's based on studies that looked at homelessness prevention and told us who we should be targeting, it enables you to go to the small church program who's giving out $100 in assistance and convince them to come along with some of your targeting decisions. And I think having that piece of paper and explaining why you've picked these particular things can be very convincing for them. So it can serve as sort of a galvanizing force in a community that allows you to make some broader targeting decisions as a group. So it's not just, as Kay's been saying, this is really a system-wide thing. It's not just one program targeting their prevention, but it's all of the programs in the community looking at a screening tool, even if it's just an initial screening tool, and saying, you know what, we all agree these are the people who are the most vulnerable in our community. It's also been shown in studies that these are the people most likely to become homeless. This is where we should be investing our resources, and then you're all moving in the same direction simultaneously.
Thank you, Sam and Kay. That was really helpful, and I think also it kind of addresses another question that was asked that came in while you were speaking, which is, you know, how do we begin this diversion conversation? So I think actually both of your comments have kind of really helped to address that. And we have another question that I think is a little broader. Someone who is in rural Oregon is asking, they're in a situation where, in an area where there's very little shelter options, very little affordable housing, limited employment options, and they want to know how all of this plays into rural American communities. So before I turn it over to Sam or Kay, I wanted to just say that we have spoken to a lot of community action agencies across the country that are working in rural areas, and certainly recognize that it's extremely challenging when you have such a lack of resources, especially if the community action agency is sometimes the only game in town doing really any work on homelessness or poverty-related issues. And what we're hearing from community action agencies, and we'd be happy to connect you to some community action agencies that are in very rural areas like Wisconsin and Texas, that you do have to be very creative in some ways, that you're looking at certainly keeping people in their homes in this situation is much more important sometimes when there aren't shelters, for example. You want to keep people where they are. You have to come up with other shelter options, or you're trying to figure out how people can be sharing housing in a way that they weren't before. And there are you're looking at more sometimes faith-based options for resources, and you're trying to figure out if the city or county that you're working in or the many counties that you're covering have emergency assistance funds that aren't being used in the way that we're talking about, because a lot of communities actually have emergency assistance funds at their city or counties, and they're not being directed this way. They're doing things like paying utility bills, and there might be ways to have to use this information that we're giving you to help garner those resources for the folks that you are serving. But I wanted to open it up to any of the other panelists if you think that there are other things that folks in, how does this play out in rural communities?
So this is Sam.
Oh, go ahead, Sam.
I'm sorry. I was just going to jump in. So when I got to the implications of research, and in my last slide, I talked about the 4 big things. And the first one was resource decisions. And I think that these kinds of questions about, you know, limited shelter in particular in a community, that's a very important question about where you divert your resources. It may make sense in places where you have limited shelter to invest a little bit more on the front end of preventing people from becoming homeless, because they're invariably going to spend time unsheltered, and it is probably in areas with very limited, not even just affordable housing, but in rural areas, very limited rental housing generally, difficult to get people back into housing. So these are all decisions that, you know, when you look at your resources, you need to take into account the flow and the other available resources in your community and think about what makes the most sense for you in terms of resource decisions. That being said, along with everything else that I said, like, if you are going to invest in prevention resources, you have to be monitoring to make sure that you're getting the people who are going to become homeless. So if you're spending a lot of money on prevention in a rural community, but you still have tons of people entering unsheltered situations, you're probably not targeting properly.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly what I was going to say, Sam. The only other thing I'd add, particularly since we're talking about families, is that what we find in rural communities, very rural communities, is that's where you often will find multi-generational families living together, and a lot more of sharing of housing. And so I think, so how does this play into all, like rural American communities? I think it really is about, again, sort of that mediation. If a situation is occurring and this, the household isn't, in a shared housing situation or multi-generational housing for families, and now, there's no resources and, all of that is very limited. Affordability and limited resources means the only option for households is to actually be able to live with somebody else. It's just the only way they can make it work. And so then sometimes it might be things like even, for landlords giving problems because, something's happened. Maybe it's just negotiating with the landlord, and we've learned, I'm going to give some real specific things. So sometimes just offering a landlord that if the household would pay a little bit more rent, they wouldn't have any problem with having 2 or 3 households sharing, if that's an issue. So it's just that, like, asking the kinds of things that we tend not to, sort of traditionally do. But, again, like Sam said, if they're right at that front door of homelessness and, and resolving that situation, you want people to keep the housing that they are, whatever housing situation they're in, because it sounds like once they lose that housing, they're going to lose it.
Thank you both, Kay and Sam, for your presentations and for those really helpful answers. At this point, I think I'm going to hand it over back to Hyacinth to wrap us up. Also, I should add that if you have questions, please feel free to email us. This slide tells us our emails, and we have a number of resources on our website as well, which is homelessness.Building there at the bottom of the slide. So please feel free to email us or to go to our website. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, ladies, for your presentation and helping to facilitate discussion with your expertise and guidance on this really important topic and issue. I think you guys gave our attendees a lot to think about and a lot of resources and approaches to really go out and practice. So, ladies, thank you again. And just to conclude on our end, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We really appreciate all of your attendance on all of these webinars, and we just want it to be noted that we do have more coming up in the future. In particular, we'd like to highlight the National Poverty Trends mini-series that we're doing, which is facilitated by the Center for Community Futures, and that our next event with them will be on September 28th. You can actually click on the registration link there, and that should take you straight to the event. We really hope that you enjoyed this webinar, and the National Alliance to End Homelessness will continue to facilitate this mini-series with us. And the next session, session 4, will actually be held in November on the 9th. So again, you can click on the link there to register, but do join us. Of course, we always appreciate your feedback and suggestions on these webinar events, how we can make them better for you, how we can make them more impactful, and also if you have any ideas or suggestions about content, please use the link here on the screen to go ahead to the survey and fill that out for us. We would really appreciate that. And here is the contact information for the LCRC team. Please feel free to reach out to any of us for any questions that you might have. I know that Cynthia, Samantha, and Kay all provided their contact information, but if at any point you have any questions that you would like to follow up with them on, or if you have questions about the LCRC or our TNCA products and services, please feel free to contact any of us. And of course, shameless plug for our newly released blog. We have the presentations and resources that are offered by NAEH featured on there as well, but also any of our other learning community groups. Each group has its own blog. We have a very extensive resource section, so please, if you're interested, go to the website, check it out, and make sure to become a follower of our website, and you'll get live updates on any posts or resources or upcoming LCRC events that are made available to you all. So with that, that actually concludes our webinar for today. Thank you all again for joining us for Decreasing Family Homelessness Session 3. Thanks so much.